Hello.
Hello. Hi. Welcome to the Awakening Educator. We are actually already live.
Okay.
So, I think we had to go live by a certain time. So we're here live on the Awakening Educator. Welcome. We are super excited to have you here today to talk about social emotional learning. Megan, I don't know. Are you here, Megan? Megan.
I apologize. I'm here. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Awakening Educator. This is Megan and Susan, as usual. We're having a Friday start, and we're excited to have Lorea Martinez join us today to talk about social and emotional learning and schools. And I really can't think of a better time for it, given all that's going on. So maybe before we get started on the actual, like what you wrote and your approach, maybe you could give us a little bit of a background about who you are and what you've been doing in the world.
Sure. And I have to say that I'm glad that I'm not the only one having that kind of Friday. My kids started school on Wednesday, and today, Friday, they were both at home with a bacterial infection on their skin. So I was like, oh, it's going to be that kind of school year. So welcome all, everything that is going to happen where we will navigate it. Anyway, so thank you so much for having me on the show. I'm Lorea Martinez. I'm a former special education teacher. I actually started my career in education working with neurodiverse students and supporting teachers to respond to the needs of diverse learners and different learning styles. And then I transitioned when I started working on my doctoral program. I transitioned to focus and looking at student achievement data. And at the time, I was working for a charter management organization based in the East Bay. And I realized that a lot of the focus that we were doing with student achievement was an important part of helping students to develop and be successful learners, but there was a part that we were missing in the ways that we were looking at how to support students to be those engaged and purposeful learners. And that's how I came to the field of social emotional learning. At the time, I had to decide what I was going to study for my doctoral dissertation and do the research. And I really wanted to look at this other set of skills that I knew would probably be impacting students and supporting them to accomplish goals and be successful. So that's how I came to SEL. And once I finished my doctoral research, I really wanted to do this work, and I fell in love with the field. And that's what I've been doing since.
That's great. Well, welcome so much. And we're glad to have you. And like I said, that it's timely. So probably most educators know what SEL is, but I think it's probably good to also just begin a little bit with the definition. So what is social emotional learning, and what does it look like traditionally, say, in a school? If you were to say someone's doing social emotional learning, what might that look like?
So SEL is a process to learn and practice essential social emotional skills. And there is a component of SEL that also includes adults. So when we think about SEL, we want to make sure that we are not only thinking about the skills that we want students to develop, but also how, as educators, we are modeling those skills for students, and also having the space in the school to look at our own practice and how we are engaging our emotions in the workplace, how we are sharing our frustrations with our students, how we are able to establish relationships. So while SEL, most of the focus has been on students, we know that the adult piece is very important, and one that it's sometimes skipped in SEL implementation plans, because we feel that sense of urgency to really bring these skills to the students. But definitely one of the things that I like to say is that as adults, we cannot teach what we don't practice. So incorporating that adult component in any SEL implementation plan is important. And traditionally, what you would see, like if you walk into a classroom that is infused with SEL, I think that you would see a lot of what you see and you would consider good teaching, right? SEL establishes the foundation for students to be able to relate with each other, to engage in purposeful learning, to be challenged by what's happening in the classroom in positive ways, in ways that they're going to grow their capacity to think deeply, to identify their emotions, to establish connections with others. So I think that is another misconception, if you may, about SEL, which is there is a component that is around teaching these skills explicitly, but at the core of everything, SEL is good teaching.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think, as we all were mentioning at the beginning, right now, we're at week 2. We just finished week 2 today here in Oakland, and it's been, I'd say, the most difficult beginning of a school year that I've ever had in the 20 years that I've been in the district, because we're navigating COVID, we're navigating coming back from having not been in the building together. There's so many stressors on the community. I'm really feeling the level of bandwidth that adults are experiencing, and also kids, to be able to show up in ways. And from the trauma-informed lens, which is where I often come from, right? I look at things from the neurobiology of trauma and stress. The stress response system is so activated right now for everybody. And when we talk about adults practicing and adults really working on their SEL skills right now, I'm concerned that the demand on the adults in the system's so great that that's the first thing to go. So how do we, and I love that you said it's just good teaching. And I think that often we think of it as a separate thing, but really good teaching provides that frustration tolerance, helps kids regulate and self-manage, social skills, being able to work in groups and collaborate in groups and hear each other's different ideas. So in this particular moment in time, when there's so many added new stressors, right? I think principals are becoming COVID managers on top of everything else that they were already stressing to do. How would you recommend making sure that we're keeping social emotional learning incorporated throughout the day, or self-management throughout this time?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I think you have highlighted some of those challenges and some of the tensions that we see when it comes to SEL implementation. And as you mentioned, SEL many times is the first thing to go, because it's still considered an add-on, even when we know how important it is. So on the adult side, there are many things that can be done, and it is not just up to the educator. So an educator can have many resources to deal with their stress, to face frustration, to deal with like difficult working conditions, but that we cannot rely on just the will of educators to do this work for themselves. Like, the structures at the school need to support that educator well-being. And there are like simple things that you can take care of your educators, like in staff meetings, for example, by allowing adults to connect with each other before you move to what's the order of business, right? I've been in so many meetings where the first thing that you do is just go into look at your agenda and item A, and there's no space for the adults to come together and check in with each other and see how are you doing today and what happened for you before you go into the business and into the action items and the things that need to happen. So creating the space during those staff meetings to really see the humanity in all those educators, and to really acknowledge, if it's a hard moment, acknowledge that is, and see what are the supports that they need. I think that building that as part of the culture of the school, a school where people are taking care of each other, goes a long way for educators to be able to sustain the energy that they need to sustain in the long term, so they can face a challenging year. And then on the student side, I think that even if we our tendency is to say students have lost so, and it's, for me, it's like quotation marks, have lost so much academic learning because of the pandemic. Now we need to even double down on the focus on academics, unless that students have a social emotional readiness level in order to learn, they will not be able to engage with academic content in meaningful ways. So the time that teachers are investing in teaching and coming together with students and connecting with students is not wasted time. Actually, you are investing time that is planting the seeds for students to be ready for learning, right? Like many of us have been in classrooms where you as an educator, you know that things are not going well, right? You know that maybe they are not getting the content, they are not paying attention, and yet you continue going because that's what has been asked from you, maybe because you are feeling the pressure of the standards or different things, right? So what SEL does is switches that paradigm and says, well, if that student is not ready for learning, let's take care of that first. So we are making sure that students are able to engage with that content. Otherwise, we're not advancing, we're not supporting students.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a few things there that I appreciate all that you shared, both of you actually. And I mean, I feel like there's concrete examples might be helpful. So I was recently helping to facilitate a conversation with a superintendent and his cabinet and principals. And it was their first time back together again. And I thought the superintendent did a really great thing, which is he started out with just like naming his reality. And he used a very simple example, like a health routine. But he was like, normally, he's like, the last time we were in this meeting together, I used to go and get one of those Danishes and sit down and have a Danish and coffee. And that was a year and a half ago. And in that year and a half, I've changed my eating routines and my norms. And I don't eat those pastries. I don't eat pastries anymore. And it was a really simple example of like, I think what he was doing in that moment that I really appreciated was just normalizing that he's a different person. He interacts in the spaces that he would in spaces that they have had in common for a long time differently. He's a different person in those spaces. He used the pastries as an example, but I thought it was a really helpful way of helping everybody to have some permission. Susan, I think your microphone is doing something.
Is it? Sorry.
Yeah, just so you know. Of naming that we're all different people. And what it did, which was great because we also then had an activity that allowed all the leaders to do that. But then each person kind of named how they were different and what they needed to be true. So I think it does have to start from the top, which is what you're naming, Lorea. I think for teachers, they can take care of themselves and we can say that, but also there's so much pressure that comes on them, and school leaders set the norms for their school or the tone in their school. And district leaders set the tone for the principals and what they feel like they can do in their schools. And I think constantly with inserting SEL or other self-care strategies, it requires an act of will and also almost like an act of subversion to have those be true in a lot of our schools. You know, like to choose to break the norm of working, like a ridiculous amount of hours a day can feel subversive, even though people aren't working extra hours really, but it feels that way. It goes against the norms, or to choose to push back on the learning goals that you were naming to create some space for that connection can feel subversive and make the leaders and teachers who are making those choices feel like they're taking a risk.
Well, it makes me think of,
happen. Go ahead.
And OUSD, in the district I work in, and when you were here, Megan, we spent many years just trying to normalize SEL welcoming and appreciation, optimistic close, for a long time, just really normalizing that at every level, because there is this piece of we sit, we connect with each other, then we do their business, and then we appreciate each other. And that ritual, that opening ritual really has an important component of I see you, you belong, we connect to each other. And it that has become regular practice, I think, in our district now. But as the bandwidth is stretched, we start to see some of these practices then fray. So even as you're saying, Megan, it's even more subversive right now than ever to take this time of when the building is like literally on fire, or it feels like it's on fire. It really takes intentional fortitude to say, no, I'm going to make it through this whole school year. And the only way to make it through the whole school year is I'm going to intentionally make sure that that social emotional needs of myself, my staff, and my students come first.
Absolutely. I think that's right. And I think it needs to be modeled. And I really wish the district folks, and I'm sure, I just saw an example of one that did, but I think there are so many that don't, that it needs to come from the district level of like, your care is so, like your self-care is crucial right now. And attending to ourselves. I'm a board member, so I spoke at our board meeting recently and was like, kind of use that same example of like, we're all different people. So again, I think the fear, and you were naming a little bit, Lorea, was people are coming back and they're like, oh, okay, we're back in the building and we're gonna do this normalized back in the building thing. But as you said, Susan, like you can't start school like it's not a normal school year, and then add to all of that, not only let's name when we're in California here, so let's name there's COVID, there's dealing with COVID outbreaks from that, dealing with all the ever-changing health standards and expectations.
The fires right now, the air now, so that adds so everybody was outside all day, now we have to go back inside.
Right. So one way we were mitigating COVID was using outdoor space, and outdoor space is not a consistent thing that we can have here in California right now, and in other parts of the country it's going to get too cold for that. And so trying to and then we keep having this pressure, but the kids need to learn at the same pace and rate that they already did, and we need to kind of jump back in. But all of us have had so many things that we've had to confront over the last year and a half plus, not only just COVID and loss of life and family and change to lifestyle and living with kind of persistent fear, because if you're a parent or anybody, but if you're a parent or a loved one who has, compromised immunity systems, you're worried all the time, at least in back burner worry. And then let's add all of the racial injustices that we've had front row seats to see, and just the pandemic of systemic racism in this country and how it's been playing out over the last 2 years in front of everyone's eyes. Like there's just a lot of trauma. Children,
and I would say that
come back to school,
that the violence that is bubbling up here in Oakland as a result of that, as a result of many of the things that you were talking about, the level of stress on the city is then bubbling up into violence in our city, which is creating a longer sense of lack of safety. And so, Laurea, I mean, I know we're taking it into this far, we're going way up here because it really feels this way. So it becomes so hard to then come back down. And I know teachers sometimes roll their eyes at me when I say, self-care and social emotional learning is such an important part of this. And it's like, how do I bring that to a teacher who's really drowning and underwater, to get them to recognize this isn't just fluff, and I'm not just saying it, but it does have to come from leadership, because leadership does have to model it and carve it out. They have to not ask teachers for things at 10 o'clock at night on a Sunday, and legal has to not ask principals for things at Friday night at midnight. And like there's all these ways that there's SEL, and then there's the systems that we talk about it, but then we don't create the systems that then reinforce it. So I'm wondering where you're sitting in all this and what you might recommend for a system to shift.
Yeah, and I would say that I see it as working simultaneously. So of course, in an ideal world, we would see it coming, from your district office all the way to, the janitor that works at your school, where everybody's practicing these skills. But at the same time, I do feel a sense of urgency that we cannot wait for somebody else to do it for me or to encourage me to do it. So there are choices that we can make as individuals in the ways that we treat ourselves, in the ways that we treat other adults or our students. And that is the level of control that we can have over our immediate circle of influence, right? And for that to happen, you don't need to wait for somebody else. You can go ahead and do it. And I think going back to kind of like this big picture that you were drawing earlier, there is a level of discomfort to letting go of what we knew in the past. Sitting with that discomfort is doing SEL. Absolutely. Right? Not moving away from what it feels to not know what's going to be the experience when I go back to my building, or how are my students going to react. Just to be open to what is that it's going to happen, and sit with that discomfort and be having clarity about what are the expectations, what are the patterns that I have as an educator that may be holding me back in this moment to respond to the reality that I have in front of me. So again, I think that we need to have kind of like both ends working in combination. Like if you are an educator who's a lead teacher or has a department chair, and you have influence, advocate for the importance of SEL. But at the same time, if you don't have that leadership position, you can still be an SEL advocate by practicing these skills in your own life, in the way that you run your classroom, right? I think that there is so much power that we have as individuals, and our modeling can go a long way with our students, right? And we're with our neighbor teacher, someone who's teaching next door to us, to see what are the things that we are doing to take care of ourselves, to take care of our students. So again, I think that we need to have those two things work in combination.
That's really helpful. We're going to, and I agree, and maybe when we come back, we could talk a little bit about some concrete examples of what that looks like. So I heard you saying, like, implementing it, but what might that look like? I have some ideas as well. I'm sure Susan does too. But when we come back from break, we can talk a little bit about what does that look like as an individual? And maybe we just start there with that unit of change. What can you change within yourself to be able to start to feel better? So we'll take a brief break, and then we come back. That's what we'll talk about. So one moment. And we're back.
Welcome back. Before we went on break, we were shifting the conversation about what does this actually look like on the day-to-day? What does it look like if you're an educator, a teacher in the classroom, or a leader in a building? What does it mean to bring SEL? And I think we didn't talk about this necessarily before we went on break, but I'd really like to hear, because we're always I hear often folks who are the champions and leaders of social emotional learning to really, it's just good instruction. But I think it'd be really helpful to talk about in concrete ways, how is it good instruction? How do you weave it into the actual instructional experience throughout the day, and what it might look like in either math or English language arts or social studies? And
yes. So I'll answer that question with kind of like two approaches. One is that SEL is a lens that we use for teaching and learning. And from that perspective, when we are bringing and infusing SEL into our classrooms, what we are doing is looking at what are the conditions, the social emotional conditions for learning that we establish. And that includes what is the kind of academic engagement and challenge that we are bringing to our students. Asking the question, are our students feeling safe psychologically, physically? Do they feel that they have something to say in our classroom? Do they have a sense of belonging? And also looking at what are the kinds of supports that our students receive. So there is kind of like this broad aspect of looking at what are those social emotional conditions for learning that is like an important component of bringing SEL into the classroom. The other aspect of infusion is a lot more concrete, and it looks at what are the specific competencies that you're going to be teaching. So in my book, Teaching with the Heart in Mind, I have the HEART acronym, which defines 5 essential social emotional skills. So for each one of those competencies, there are ways in which you can infuse that particular skill into your teaching practice. So for example, the H stands for honor your emotions. So if you want to think about how to honor your emotions in your classroom, a way to do that is by looking at how students transition between periods, or creating emotional check-ins in the classroom where you are creating a space for students to share their emotions, maybe provide feedback about how things are going for them, what's their experience. And then there's another part around thinking for that particular skill, how that can be infused with academic content. So a quick example on the honoring your emotions in the subject of math, we know that math has been a difficult subject for many of us. And there are many emotions that come up for students when they are presented with math content. Even being in a math classroom, that triggers some reactions. And that's based on what are the emotional experiences that students have attached to the math instruction. So as learners, in the past they have perceived that they have not been successful, or they feel paralyzed or overwhelmed when they are in front of they have to solve a multiple step problem. They have emotional memories that are attached to those experiences. So that means as educators, we need to kind of normalize the fact that we have different emotions based on the topics and the subjects that are presented to us as human beings. So that would be a way in the math class to really acknowledge, oh, math is subject. What are some of the emotions that come up for you? And then helping to students, the second step would be to reframe. Okay, if you are feeling, once you have named your emotion and you realize that you are feeling frustrated or angry, maybe you are afraid because you're gonna maybe solve that problem incorrectly, or you don't feel like you have enough resources or tools to solve what's being asked from you. Then going to look at what are some of the thoughts that students tell themselves while they are having those emotions. And many of those thought patterns are very negative. We tell ourselves, oh, you are stupid, you don't know anything, you should know better, right? So that increases that emotional reaction, and it also it diminishes our ability to perform and do the task successfully. So as a math teacher, you would help students to reframe that and to notice when that happens to them. So the first step would be to name that emotion and notice when that's coming up as a student, and then looking at what are some alternative ways in which I can talk to myself in order to be able to simply engage with the task, let alone resolve the problem successfully, right? So that's a process that if you teach that process to students and you do it over time, students are going to have all these tools in order to be able to notice when they have that reaction, and then switch a little bit that thinking in order to engage with the task. And that's something that I'm giving the example in math because that's the most common.
I use math all the time. I mean, you know, whenever I'm teaching about trauma in the brain, I almost always talk about math. But it isn't. It's just that it does activate a lot of folks. I actually love math, and I'm pretty good at math. But many of the kids. But and when you're what you're talking about, I know, Megan, you're just razzing me. But when we're talking, I talk about this in the aspect of the stress response system, right? I'm trained at Dr. Bruce Perry's neurosequential model, and we talk about the stress response. And as you're talking, I'm thinking about that if we're able to keep kids within that window of tolerance, so where they still have access to the thinking part of the brain and can use the top-down approach to, I notice when this feeling's coming up, I can honor it. And I haven't like gone so much up the arousal continuum that I'm dysregulated, where then I can't think and can't use my thinking brain to calm myself down. So it's almost like intertwining these skills to prevent kids from getting to the point where they're so escalated that they rip up their paper and give up. It's helping them do that ahead of time. So if it's taught as a regular skill throughout instruction while kids are learning, through over time, becomes something that they're able to more effectively incorporate.
Absolutely. And I think an important part is normalizing the fact that we have different emotions depending on what's presented to us. And in this case, we're talking about the example of content, but there are different emotions that come up for students that are more introverted, for example, and they are being asked to engage in a work group all the time. For students that, may have different learning styles. So there are several scenarios where it is helpful to acknowledge as educators that students are going to have different emotional reactions, and that it's okay for students to have those feelings, right? I think that what we are teaching students with SEL when we do it explicitly is building that emotional fluency so students can go in and out of that cycle, right, a lot quicker. So even if they are being triggered or they are feeling upset, that
It's a working and we're all working moms around here, so we're very familiar with dogs and children coming in and out. It's part of what makes the show
no respect for what we're doing here.
So anyway, so what I was saying is that that emotional fluency, we come in and out of that cycle a lot faster. So students are able to notice that that's happening, but having the tools to process those feelings, and then they can move on to the next thing. And I think that's from the work that I've been doing. I think that's the biggest part that requires more attention, because there is a lot of unlearning that we adults need to do in order to teach that effectively.
Yeah, I guess that's what I was going to say is I'm all on board with what both of you are sharing around normalizing emotions, helping people to move through them, acknowledging them. And I think as adults, we don't always have that unlock ourselves. And when we don't have it under control, or we're not aware of our own emotional experience, then it's really hard for us to even teach that. So I appreciate in your book, you made the point that SEL is for adults too. I agree. I often go about it through the mindfulness angle. So, so adults need to be practicing these things first, because they need to know what it feels like to move through an emotional cycle, to be able to verbalize it, to be able to demonstrate it for their kids, so that the kids can understand what it is, so they can guide that for their kids. So that's number one. Number two, and maybe getting back to, I'm a pragmatist, like what can adults do now? I do think it's, to kind of address this moment, I do think it's attending to their emotional regulation. And so I'm often on many a podcast saying this same fact I'm going to say here. And I feel like I've probably said 100 times, Susan, I'm going to say it again. But, our nervous systems, adults in this classroom, our nervous systems, we can use our nervous systems to regulate our kids as well. So if we're triggered and activated, and before we had science to back this up, anybody who's been a teacher or worked with kids knows this anecdotally, which is if you're in a bad mood, even if you're smiling on your face, even if you're doing things normally, but if under the surface you're angry, things tend to fall apart in that classroom, because kids are picking up on the subconscious and unspoken cues that are coming from you. And they're reacting in there, whatever their reaction is to that moment. So the converse is also true. And that's the good story here, which is when we're regulated, when we're calmer, when we're grounded, then kids can entrain to our nervous system as well. And it can help to calm them down. And so for me, this just kind of keeps coming back to the main point of, like, adults, you're all freaking out right now because it's incredibly hard, difficult. So that's normal and okay. And the best way to see through this moment, and we were going to go to the break to talk about it, so maybe I'm stuck to my point on this one, but the first step is really to start to attend to ourselves and regulating our own nervous system. So not working to the point of exhaustion and burnout, and that's really difficult for educators in this moment. So I also want to say that too. Like, it's really easy for me. I'm not in a school right now to be like, principals, just let your teachers go home, or principals don't
or even above that, right?
Yeah.
Like, because the principals really, the principals are working beyond right
Everyone's
now.
working 12, 15-hour days. And so it's easy for me to say this as someone who's not in the system right now, to be like, just quit and stop working. I get how much is going on. I mean, because I'm a school board member, I'm watching and getting updates from the superintendent at all hours of the day and night. And everyone's having to shift all the time. So I also want to name, like, I get how hard this is. And what are the min specs in this moment? So what are the minimum things that must be taken care of in this moment, and what can be let go of? So I guess I want to offer, like, self-care is important. There are lots of ways of doing it. Being aware of your emotional, weather system, whatever we want to call that, is helpful. And you can do that all day long. So, like, I guess my number one point is, like, some SEL strategies, if done well, and to your point, Lorea, are done, like, just dated, like, as you're teaching, as you're doing these things. But finding ways to attend to your own needs is really important as you're doing all the busy work. So even if that's like a 5-minute break, or going outside to get some having a meeting outside on a bench with your colleagues rather than inside, if that's possible. Whatever is possible for you.
Making sure you go to the bathroom and drink some water. Like really,
go to the bathroom, eat well, like order, have food ordered and delivered into you. So if you feel like you can't stop working, what are some things you can take off your plate or to show yourself some care that are going to help you to kind of get through this moment? And what can be put aside in this moment? So what can be taken off? Like if dealing with COVID outbreaks is the thing, then what else can go to the side in this moment? I guess is all I'm offering. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting, Megan, as you're talking, I was in a meeting the other day and we were asked about self-care, as we often are. And folks in that meeting in that moment were like, self-care is off the table. I just need to focus on self-management. I just need like that. I feel like that feels doable right now, but self-care feels too big. So what are the ways that I'm taking care of like self-coping and self-management? That felt like they could do that when it was just like some regulating and some like, that's it, basics. So
emotional is self-management, like emotional regulation and
like just those little things like going to the bathroom and stuff.
And it makes a difference if that conversation only happens like, the first meeting that you have where we know that self-care is important, and then it never happens again until the week before winter break, right? Then you know that it's not embedded, right? But if there is a reminder every single time, and there are different opportunities and different offerings at the school in things that maybe you don't want to participate, right? Or there are certain things that don't work for you. But the fact that the school is making the intentional effort to keep bringing it up and making sure that you have some time at least to reflect on what you did that week, and there's certain things that work and others that didn't. I think that is that reminder that that's really important. I think that, if you think of any behavior management effort, I'm just thinking about like when, it was real important to put your seatbelt when we were in the cars, right? As a kid, I rode with no seatbelt. And my parents, it was like on and off. So thinking about like, well, if there is a constant reminder of like why this is important and what are the consequences if we don't take care of ourselves, I think that in embedding it in like what happens in the school, it is easier that as individuals, as a collective too, that we are having that sense of shared responsibility that it's not only me, but also if I see a colleague that is not doing well or they are going, that they're not taking care of themselves, that I can say something or be a support to them, right? Really prioritizing that this is something that we need to do for ourselves and each other.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I really appreciate your point, Lorea, of it's not enough to just say it once. You have to actually bring it up all the time. And it's not enough just to go through the motions, but you also actually have to start to implement it. So I've been in many meetings where there's some gentle opening and ending with appreciations, but what happens in between the meeting also doesn't feel so great. So how can we also then really start to model what it looks like to do this work, model it in our classrooms and find small ways to do that. We have our second break and then we're almost done. So we'll have a few more minutes. I'd like to hear a little bit more about the book and some ideas folks can use. So let's take a brief break and then we'll come right back.
Welcome back to the Awakening Educator. We are in our final segment with Lorea Martinez talking about social emotional learning and her book, Teaching with Heart and Mind. I knew what it was. I sort of. So welcome back. We really would like to hear a little more about the book and how folks can learn about what you're doing and how they might implement some of these really key strategies that you have.
Yeah, so something that maybe we didn't talk about as much is the importance of relationships. And I know that that's a theme that was very important to me when I started to write the book, not only because the research supports how much having those consistent positive relationships with adults, the positive impact it can have on students, but also to find ways that we can apply that and make it an intentional practice for educators. I think that for teachers who are effective educators, they have been creating and nurturing positive relationships in their classroom. And maybe that's something that comes natural to them. And that is not true for all educators. Some other teachers may need to put a little bit more practice, and that's completely normal too. All of the social emotional skills are things that we can learn and develop over time, and that includes also establish positive relationship with students. So in the book, I talk a little bit about how to build trust with students, which is such a fundamental part of creating a positive classroom environment. How to establish that emotional connection, and that has to do with what we just discussed, the fact that as educators, if we are practicing honoring our emotions, it is easier that we'll have that kind of like open our heart to establish those connections with students. And there's also an important component on relationships, which is developing our cultural competence. And again, because we have a high number of educators in our classrooms that are female and white, but our student population is a lot more diverse, that it's such an important aspect also of having the tools to develop those relationships and to do it in authentic ways that are supportive of students and affirming to their identities. So I think the book provides a lot of practical applications for how to establish those positive relationships.
I'm curious because one of the things about relationships in particular, and coming from the trauma lens, is that many of us who have experienced developmental trauma or early relational trauma have relationships are complex, right? And that we want to be in relationship, but it also can be a triggering and evocative, and sort of working with the building relationships, but also being attuned to young people's boundaries so that we're building that trust over time. And so what I've seen is sometimes I see teachers who really want to build trust, but they're moving too fast and they're coming in and trying to build, they're crossing kids' boundaries because they're not really aware of the boundaries that they have. So that being a social emotional skill, to be able to be attuned to where's the boundary for this young person and how do I step up to it without crossing it in a way that over time builds trust and builds relationship. I feel I've been more and more weaving this in because I have seen more and more. We talk about relationships. We talk about relationships in schools as being key and the most important thing. And I see teachers really trying, but not recognizing how they're actually triggering their students by trying too hard, by crossing that boundary.
Yes, absolutely. And as individuals, we are complex socially and emotionally, so our needs are different. And I think part of the art of how you implement SEL in your classroom is fine-tuning, like how you establish those relationships with students and really honoring who they are as individuals and listening to those boundaries, right? I think that in our society, we have this idea that everything that we do, we need to do it fast, and fast is better. And I think that with relationships is quite the opposite, right? Like certain relationships, I'm sure that the audience can relate to this. Sometimes they don't flourish until many months later after maybe you have been planting seeds, right? With students. So I think that being patient, that not because you're asking that student every day, oh, how's soccer going, that relationship is going to develop, but that you're really listening and creating the space, like you were saying, to make that happen in an organic way, right? It doesn't need to be forced. It just needs to be kind of that consistent daily practice, the same way that we are breathing, right? We are putting ourselves out there to establish those relationships, but in a way that is organic and that it's not forced, that we are really respecting each other's spaces, because that's truly the way that we are acknowledging each other's humanity, right? And we may have different needs and different needs as an individual overall, but also different needs in different days, right? Maybe there are certain days when I'm like, don't talk to me, I don't want to know anything about you. And other days when I'm like really open and want to tell you all about, what happened. So I think, again, remembering that fast isn't, quick and fast is not better, and just let it grow as an organic process.
Yeah, and that reminds me, I mean, and that means that we're, again, aware of that. So I think that's like the first step, right? Is we need to be aware of, slow down enough to be aware of our motivations and our impact on others, and to be able to notice it. And that's hard to do in a classroom. So I want to normalize for teachers, like there's, 100 million things happening all at the same time, because you're also teaching, and you're, like you're managing the relationships between the kids and all the other chaos that happens in a classroom. So it's no small feat, but I do appreciate the idea of starting small and of letting it build. As both of you were talking, it made me remember, an analogy Brene Brown used for building trust. And she actually centered it in an experience in her kid's classroom, which is, a marble jar. And I like this analogy for educators because it's something that we know. So when we're trying to build a classroom culture or help the kids to get towards some kind of a goal, we often will have some kind of a goal that the kids are working towards, that you're building towards. The analogy she used was a marble jar, and that the teacher put marbles in the jar every time the kids did something that they were supposed to do. And once the jar was full, they're going to get some kind of an award. I don't know what they're going to get. Maybe
pizza party
or candy or something, probably something unhealthy, but some kind of party. And she likened that to trust, that actually when you're building trust with someone, it's very similar. So it's not always these overt things, but it's something that's built up over time, and it's small, subtle things that are unique to us. So she gave examples, like she was helping her daughter sort out who were like her marble jar friends, and marble jar friends were ones that knew who her daughter spent time with, like that her grandmother was sick, or that maybe something was going on at home, with their dog. It didn't have to be major, like personal things, but they knew enough about her daughter's life that they would be able to connect in. And so I think it takes those small moments to build up, to create that trust. And you can't force it, especially when there can be cultural dynamics that are different. And if we're not aware of them, that we're stepping on them, there's no faster way to undermine trust and create a lack of safety in a classroom than to cross people's boundaries, especially ones that are tied to cultural identity and norms. So it's important to tread lightly and intentionally.
I really like that example. There, it made me think of Miss Zaleski, who's a kindergarten teacher here in Oakland. She puts sticky notes on the desk with each of the kids' names at the beginning of the week, and throughout the week, she looks for opportunities to give them specific positive feedback that then she writes on the sticky notes and gives it to them. But since she has all the kids' notes out at the beginning of the week, she knows every kid gets one throughout the week. And there was a parent who had been in her class was like, and then the kid would bring it home to their parent, the sticky note of appreciation. And one of the parents was saying that they made a little scrapbook out of all of the sticky notes throughout the year. And it was like the most heartwarming relationship building teacher move, right? Like, and really not that difficult to do, because it becomes part of the ritual and part of the practice. And it's so meaningful. And over the year, you're building relationships. So the marbles, the sticky notes, these little things that happen in the neurosequential model, we call them dosing and spacing, right? That we're dosing and spacing therapeutic opportunities or relational experiences, weaving through with the doses of stress, so that, because we know that the activation of the stress is what helps us learn and grow. And then the activation of love and trust is what helps us feel safe enough to do that. And so it's this pendulating thing that allows us to grow and learn.
I love that, because that makes sure that every single kid gets a note by the end of the week. And so simple and easy. I love that. I'm going to steal that. Thank you, kindergarten teacher. I think that's just a really great example. So we're already at the top of the hour, or the end of the bottom of the hour, wherever we are in the hour. How can people connect with you, Lorea, if they want to learn more about the work that you're doing?
Yeah, so I have a website. It's loreamartinez.com. And the first chapter of the book is currently available for free as a download. And on the website, there's a resources page, and I have additional free downloads. I recently published a discussion guide for the book. So if educators want to come together as a group and read the book and use some of the strategies and then reflect on how it went, implement, and do kind of like a cycle of inquiry that's available to them. And also there's a scope and sequence and other resources that they can use that go along with the book. I'm also on social media. I hang out on Twitter at Lorea Mart and Facebook at Lorea Martinez SCL. And always happy to connect with people on LinkedIn as well.
Thank you so much. This was, I mean, it's a really invaluable topic, and I really appreciate how practical you've made it and accessible for educators. So thank you
and
so much.
Super timely, as you said, Megan, super timely. As always, like us, follow us, rate us. It really helps. So thank you,
absolutely.
everybody.
Yeah, please rate the show. Please share it with others. Not only does it help Susan and I to improve, but also it helps us to feel like people are listening. So we like it. So please listen, rate, tell people about it. And yeah, Dr. Lorea Martinez, thank you so much for being with us.
All right. Make sure everybody do your self-care.
Something.
And happy Friday.